images, and 2, what is worship? So, number 1, the issue of statues and images. So the commandment is from the chapter, the 20th chapter of Exodus, verse 4. If we can go there very quickly. It comes from Moses receiving the commandments. I won't call them the 10 commandments because it doesn't say that there were 10, but we have traditionally known them as the 10 commandments. So the commandment goes like this. It's Exodus chapter 20, verse 4. It goes like this. You shall not make for yourself an idol, whether in the form of anything that is in heaven above, or that is on the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. You shall not bow down to them or worship them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, punishing children for the iniquity of parents to the 3rd and 4th generation of those who reject me, but showing steadfast love to the 1,000th generation of those who love me and keep my commandments. This is Exodus chapter 20, verse 4 to verse 6. Let me repeat it. You shall not make for yourself an idol, whether in the form of anything that is in heaven above, or that is on the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. I want to emphasize this part. You shall not make. It goes on to say, you shall not bow down to them or worship them. For I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, punishing children for the iniquity of parents to the 3rd and the 4th generation of those who reject me, but showing steadfast love to the 1,000th generation of those who love me and keep my commandments. So there is something very important when one is reading the Bible, and that something is called context. Context allows us to understand exactly what is being communicated outside simply taking what is written at face value. There are many times when what is written at face value isn't actually what is being communicated. For example, when Jesus says that if your right hand leads you to sin, cut it off and throw it away. Or if your right eye causes you to sin, pluck it out and throw it away. If you take this literally, it means that none of us would be walking around with a full body. All of us would be walking around maimed, with no hands, no feet, no eyes. What is in the particular instance that I've just mentioned of Jesus saying you pluck out your eye or chop off your arm, what is being used there is what is called hyperbole. That is a form of exaggeration. But the context basically is Jesus telling people that you would rather suffer in the act of trying not to sin than to live a comfortable life and end up going to hell. That is what is being communicated. He's not literally saying that go ahead and cut off your body parts. So context is important in understanding the Bible. Now, when it comes to the context of this particular passage where God is saying you shall not make, notice he says you shall not make for yourself an idol. In other passages, this is the New Revised Standard Version, so other translations say you shall not make for yourself a graven image. You shall not make. So the first commandment is not to make them. Immediately this raises issues because we make graven images all the time. Where I work, for example, we have the bust of Ben Chiwanuka. If you go to the Ugandan Museum, you'll find several statues of several different figures. You'll find statues of Kabaka Mutesa. You'll find statues of Kawaka Ronald Muwenda Mutebi. We see statues of President Museveni all the time. If you look at, for example, something as big as Mount Rushmore, it has 4 graven images of 4 faces of presidents. So the question is, are we breaking this commandment? The commandment has said you shall not make a graven image. You shall not make. That is the first part. Many people tend to ignore this part in their haste to accuse Catholics of idolatry. They forget that this commandment says you shall not make. They rush to the part of you shall not bow down. That's the part where most people want to squeeze Catholics. They want to rush to the part of you shall not bow down to them. And then they forget that the first part is you shall not make. So you can see the problem here, because almost every Christmas you will find non-Catholics, all the different types of Protestant denominations, whether it's the Anglicans, the Pentecostals, I don't know if the Seventh-day Adventists do it, the Methodists, the Lutherans, all these other, all these branches of Protestants, you'll find what they call nativity scenes every Christmas. And the nativity scene is 3 figurines of Jesus, Mary, Joseph, the shepherds, the 3 wise men, and animals. Obviously, no one thinks there's anything wrong with that. But the passage in the Bible that I've just read is saying, you shall not make them. So the question is, are we breaking a commandment by making small figurines for the nativity scene? Are we breaking this commandment by making Mount Rushmore? Are we breaking this commandment by making the bust of Ben Chwanuka, by making statues of President Museveni, of Kabaka Mwenda Mutebi, of Kabaka Mutesa? The answer obviously is we are not breaking this commandment. Just intuitively we know we are not sinning by taking clay and making something. And rightly so, because this commandment taken in context is forbidding the sin of idolatry. It is forbidding people worshipping anything else apart from God. This commandment is actually forbidding any worship of anything apart from God, even if that something is not a graven image. So even if that something is a tree or a stone or a piece of rock or a mountain or some abstract entity, if it is not God, then we are committing idolatry by worship. So this commandment has to be taken in context. And we know, for example, we know that God had nothing against making statues, because in the very same in the desert, God commands Moses to make the Ark of the Covenant, which, as we know, had 2 statues of angels on it above the mercy seat. And we also know that he commands Moses to make a bronze serpent when the Jews are attacked by snakes, such that anyone who would look at it would be healed. So God himself had nothing against making statues. And someone could argue, I've had people saying things like, okay, but in those instances, it was God who commanded them to be made. Well, we have a very interesting case of people making these images without consulting God, and the Bible doesn't say they ever consult God, and God actually blessing them. If you go to the book of 1 Kings, the first book of Kings, 1 Kings chapter 7, verse 25 and verse 25. This is the part where Solomon is building the temple, and he calls in a bronze worker called Hiram to make certain items for the temple. And he says that in verse 23, so he starts making the molten sea. He makes the molten sea, and it says that in verse 25, it says that under its brim were panels all around it, each of 10 cubits surrounding the sea. There were 2 rows of panels cast when it was cast. It stood on 12 oxen, 3 facing north. It stood on 12 oxen. It stood on 12 oxen. 3 facing north, 3 facing west, 3 facing south, and 3 facing east. Then later in verse 29, he goes ahead and makes, it says, on the borders of the bronze pillars that he made, on their borders were lions, oxen, and angels, cherubim. So in that very temple, in the house set aside for worshiping God in Jerusalem, Solomon hires a gentleman who makes images, who makes statues of oxen, of lions, of angels, and puts them in the place of worship in the temple. And we know that God, not only did God not have a problem with this, God actually blesses this entire activity by blessing the temple. In 1 Kings chapter 8, verse 6, it says that then the priests brought the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord to its place in the inner sanctuary of the house, in the most holy place, underneath the wings of the cherubim. So they made bigger angels, bigger cherubim, underneath whose wings they placed the Ark of the Covenant already with its own cherubim on top. For the cherubim spread out their wings over the place of the ark, so that the cherubim made a covering above the ark and its poles. So then in verse 10 to 11, and when the priests came out of the holy place, a cloud filled the house of the Lord, so that the priests could not stand to minister because of the cloud, for the glory of the Lord filled the house of the Lord. The glory of the Lord comes down onto the temple, and which temple is filled with images. It's filled with painted images. If you Google and look at images of the first temple, it was filled with painted images. It was also filled with statues of animals and of angels. So we know that even from the beginning, in their place of worship, the Jews had statues, and God blessed their place of worship. Again, context matters. This commandment is about idolatry, worshipping something that is not God. So then someone might say, okay, fine, the Jews had images in their temples, but they didn't bow down to these images, right? They didn't bow down. So now the problem is, it's one thing to have a statue, but it's another thing to bow down to the statue. So then the question becomes does bowing imply worship? And the quick answer is obviously not, because we bow in everyday life without ever intending to worship whatever we are bowing to. People bow to each other all the time. The Japanese use bowing as part of their greeting. We know for a fact they are not worshiping each other. Some tribes will bow down to their kings. Some tribes will even prostrate themselves on the ground. Even here in Uganda, we have kingdoms where the person, if you're in the presence of the king, you will prostrate yourself on the ground. This does not imply worship. It is just a form of respect given to someone who is royalty. So then, and in the Bible, we also see instances of worship, instances of bowing that do not include worship. For example, in Genesis chapter 33, verse 3, when Jacob meets his brother Esau, he bows down to him 7 times. And I'm sure in none of these 7 times was Jacob worshipping Esau. Genesis chapter 33, verse 3, it says that he himself, Jacob himself, went on ahead of his family, bowing himself to the ground 7 times until he came near his brother. And then when the family of Jacob met Esau, each person bowed to Esau. It says in verse 6, that chapter 33, verse 6, then the maids drew near, they and their children, and bowed down. Leah likewise and her children drew near and bowed down. And finally Joseph and Rachel drew near and bowed down. So bowing doesn't mean worship. And I think this is obvious to us in daily life. In Genesis chapter 19, verse 1, when Lot sees the 2 angels who have come to punish Sodom and Gomorrah, he sees them as 2 men standing at the gate. When he goes to greet them, he bows low to the ground. In Luke chapter 24, verse 5, the empty tomb, when the women go to the empty tomb and they find the angels there, it says that they were full of fear and they bowed down. None of these is an example of worship, because bowing doesn't always mean worship. So to bow to someone or to something does not mean that you're worshiping it or them. So then I think then the problem maybe becomes a combination of the two. Someone could say, okay, fine, a statue is not always an idol unless it is worshipped. Bowing doesn't always mean worship unless the person bowing intends to use it to mean worship. For example, in the book of Daniel, when the king demands everyone to bow down to him as God, Daniel's 3 friends refused to do so, because in that instance, bowing was meant to signify worship. So bowing doesn't always signify worship unless it is meant to signify worship. A statue isn't always an idol unless it has been created to be an idol. So someone might say, okay, I accept both those propositions. However, when you combine them, when you combine bowing in front of a statue or an image, then there you have worship. Bowing alone may not be worship. The statue itself may not be an idol. But when you have bowing in front of a statue, surely at that moment you have worship. So when Catholics bow in front of a statue of the Blessed Virgin Mary or of one of the saints, that in that case is worship. The statue itself is not an idol. Bowing itself is not worship, but when you combine them the way Catholics do, it must be worship. Surprisingly, the answer is still no. The answer is still no. You can still bow to an image without worshipping it. So we can go to Joshua, the book of Joshua, chapter 7, verse 6 to 16. That's Joshua, chapter 7, verse 6. So it says that, this is Joshua chapter 7, verse 6. It says that, then Joshua tore his clothes and fell to the ground on his face before the ark of the Lord until the evening, he and the elders of Israel. So, let me repeat that. Then Joshua tore his clothes and fell to the ground on his face before the ark of the Lord until evening. Joshua and the elders of Israel bowed down, prostrate on the ground in front of the Ark of the Covenant. The question is, were they worshipping the Ark of the Covenant? No. No, they were worshipping God. But they did it in front of the Ark of the Covenant. So you have an instance of bowing and prostration in front of an image with statues of angels on it, combined without it still being worship. Joshua did not worship the Ark of the Covenant by carrying out that act. So I think we as Catholics, we have to be sympathetic and understand where the non-Catholics, all these different Protestant denominations, the evangelical Protestants, the Anglicans, the Lutherans, the Methodists, the Seventh-day Adventists, the Pentecostals, the whole lot of them, when they are coming after Catholics for how Catholics behave in the presence of pictures or images of holy people, they are remembering the instances of idolatry in the Bible. For example, the Philistines worshipping Dagon, or the people bowing down in front of the king as God in the book of Daniel. When someone has read these verses, it is very easy for them to look at what Catholics do and say those people are worshipping idols. But as we have seen, all images are not always idols, bowing is not always worship, and even bowing in front of an image is not always worship. So the question then becomes, what exactly is worship? When do you worship something? So I would say that my first definition of worship would be to treat something as God. It's plain and simple. To treat something as God is to worship that something. So if you treat a tree as God, even if bowing is not in your culture, if in your culture it's not bowing, if in your culture it is lighting a fire and dancing around that tree, but in your heart that tree is God, that is idolatry. That is idolatry. So any interior disposition that acknowledge, any interior acknowledgement of something as God is worship. So if you say that this statue of Dagon, like the Philistines did, this statue of Dagon is my God, is the god Dagon, then you have worshipped that statue. But if you don't acknowledge something as God, you have not worshipped that something. You can even worship something in your heart without For example, if they say, if you captured a group of maybe of pagans who are worshipping some kind of deity, and they had the image right in front of them, and it said anyone who bows in front of that image, we are going to kill them because we don't accept idolatry here. So everyone passing, no one is allowed to bow in front of their idol. If people passed in front of that idol and didn't bow down to it, but in their hearts they said, my God Dagon, I am not allowed to bow to you, but I worship and praise you as my God, I think it is safe to say that that person has still worshipped that idol. So we see that worship is primarily an internal act, of the will to recognize something as God and to give that something the respect and the adulation and the adoration and veneration that is due only to God. That is the only time you worship something, is if you, in your heart, you see that something as God. Period. That's actually a very simple summary of what it is to worship. So, should we go ahead and say, therefore, there are no external acts that signify worship? Well, not necessarily. So we've seen that bowing can signify worship if the person bowing recognizes the thing he's bowing to as God. If the person bowing does not recognize the thing he's bowing to as God, for example, a Japanese man bowing to his friend, a person bowing to a king here in Uganda, or a Catholic bowing to a statue of the Blessed Virgin Mary, neither of those instances is worship. But if a person bows down to something and in their heart recognizes that something as God, that person has committed the sin of idolatry. So bowing sometimes can signify worship if that's what you intend it to signify, and other times it will not signify worship if you don't intend it to signify that. However, there is one act given to us in the Bible by God and done by the Jews and Catholics to this day that always signifies worship. There is only one external act. There's only one thing that you can do externally that in all instances is translated as worship. And that something, ladies and gentlemen, is the act of offering sacrifice. To offer sacrifice to something is always construed as worship. It is always seen as worship. And that's why the patriarchs always offered sacrifice on altars, starting with Abel, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. All of them, they offered sacrifice on altars whenever there was some major event in their lives, as an external act of worshiping God. Yes, there were times, yes, you can go back home to your bedroom, get down on your knees, bow down your head to the ground and worship God in your heart. Because like as we have seen, you can worship. First is primarily an internal disposition. But to manifest this act of worship externally, there is only one thing you could do that was always seen as worship, and that was to offer sacrifice. And we know this is the case because it is the very reason for which the temple is built. It is also the only reason for which Moses is commanded by God to build the tabernacle with its sanctuary and Holy of Holies. What was happening in the sanctuary? What was happening in the tabernacle? What was happening inside the Holy of Holies? If you have read your Bible, you know that these are places of sacrifice. So the priesthood is established by God in the Levites, particularly in Aaron and his descendants, for the primary purpose of offering sacrifice. So while you have that among the patriarchs, before the priesthood is established by God, the patriarchs were offering sacrifice. And at one point, anybody could offer sacrifice as a form of worship. But when God takes the Jews out of Egypt, takes them into the desert, and establishes a priesthood, only the priests could offer sacrifice. Why? Why was it only the priests that could offer sacrifice? because sacrifice was an act of worship. It was the only externally recognized act of worship. It was the only thing you could do visibly. That was all. Bowing was not. It wasn't bowing. It wasn't singing. It wasn't dancing. It wasn't raising hands. As much as all those things are good, there was only one act that God himself recognized as worship physically, and that was the act of offering sacrifice. And like I have said, this is the reason for which the tabernacle is built, the tabernacle with its Holy of Holies and the sanctuary. And then when they reach the promised land, Israel, that small setup of the sanctuary, tabernacle, Holy of Holies, becomes the temple. And what happens in the temple? Sacrifices are offered in the temple. For example, during the Passover, all the male Jews who are the heads of their households had to go to Jerusalem, to the temple, to sacrifice from there, because that's where God had told them this is the place of worship. So I want to get into something that I find very exciting, especially if you're a Catholic, because you realize that after the Old Testament is dissolved and the New Testament is inaugurated by Christ, we still have now the question of what is worship. Well, worship still is an interior disposition, to try and treat something like God. In the book of Revelation, when John is interacting with one of the angels, he bows down and tries to worship the angel. That interior movement of trying to acknowledge the angel as God, and the angel tells him, "Stop it! I'm not God. I'm just a servant like you." So that interior, that saying that this must be God. But that, like we have seen, that is not the divinely recognized physical demonstration of worship. As we have seen that the divinely recognized physical demonstration of worship, as much as it is important for it to begin here, it must also express itself out here, is the offering of sacrifice. And where do we find that in Christianity? As much as it's good to go to a nice place that has nice music and a preacher who is very fiery, very charismatic, saying very many good things, inspiring people, reading the Bible, asking people to change their lives, having a good choir that sings very emotionally moving songs that make people cry and raise their hands, and even have that interior disposition of worship. That's not how God has set up his people to worship. There is still something missing in that setup of saying that I'm going to church or I'm going to worship because we are going to do praise and worship music. They are going to play a nice guitar, a nice piano. The choir is going to be really out of this world. The pastor is going to be in his groove, in his element, and we are going to have a very good session of worship, of praise and worship. As much as that sounds nice, if you read this book, that was not part of the worship of God. That was not the main way to worship God that was instituted by divine command to Jews and to Christians, because Christians are the fulfillment of the Old Testament. The New Testament is the fulfillment of the Old Testament. What is missing in that setup? What is missing in that big, in that big amphitheater with that fiery preacher and that amazing choir and all these people crying and raising their arms and singing along and feeling that they are really in praise and worship? What's missing? What's missing? What's missing? What is missing is the offering of sacrifice. And where do we get that? Where do we get that? Well, so we know that the sacrifice of the animals of the old covenant was replaced, superseded forever by the one sacrifice of Christ. In previous videos that shall be tagged, or it shall be tagged in the you can check out my channel, Catholic Guy. It's on YouTube. I go into detail on this topic, so I will not go into much detail here, but I will just try and summarize and say this. The cows and bulls and pigeons and goats that were sacrificed in the old covenant were replaced and superseded forever by the one and eternal sacrifice of Jesus Christ that ends on the cross when he says it is finished. Ends on the cross and begins where? Begins at the Last Supper, when he takes the bread and says, "This is my body." And he takes the cup and says, "This is the blood of the new and everlasting covenant." The Last Supper and the cross are the beginning and the end of the one sacrifice of Jesus Christ to God the Father eternally, to replace the sacrifices of the old covenant and usher in the new and everlasting covenant. So how do we participate and partake of that sacrifice of Christ to God the Father? How do we participate and partake in that one sacrifice? How do we go over and above the music and the preaching and the reading of the scriptures and add sacrifice, the dimension of sacrifice, to our worship, which, as we have seen, is the proper way that God has ordained? Well, we know first and foremost that Jesus tells the apostles, "Do this in memory of me." Do this. Do what? Do what I have done. What are the priests? What are the apostles becoming? The apostles are becoming priests. What do priests do? They offer sacrifice. What have the apostles been commanded to do? To take the bread, consecrate it into the body of Christ. To take the blood, consecrate it into the blood of Christ, and offer it to God the Father as a sacrifice. And we know that this was the center of Christian worship, that the Eucharist was the center of Christian worship. From the very beginning, from the word go, what was the center of Christians when they came together to worship God was sacrifice, and the sacrifice of the Eucharist. So Luke tells us in Acts chapter 2, verse 42. This is very soon after the resurrection of Christ. So we are now in the age of the apostles. So Luke tells us that in chapter 2, Acts chapter 2, verse 42, that the Christians devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and fellowship, to the breaking of bread and the prayers. Verse 46 of the same chapter says, "Day by day they spent much time together in the temple. They broke bread at home and ate their food with glad and generous hearts." So let me repeat verse 42. The Christians devoted themselves, Acts chapter 2, verse 42, the Christians devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and fellowship, to the breaking of bread and the prayers. What was the breaking of the bread? What was the breaking of the bread? It was the celebration of the Eucharist. How do we know this? Because Paul talks about it in 1 Corinthians. You can go to 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 21. So 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 21. So Paul is admonishing the Corinthians for how they participate in the Eucharist. And he says, 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 21, "You cannot drink the cup of the Lord and the cup of demons. you cannot partake of the table of the Lord and the table of demons. I repeat, you cannot drink the cup of the Lord and the cup of demons. You cannot partake of the table of the Lord and the table of demons. Why is Paul equating or seeing parallels between a Christian going to eat food that has been sacrificed to idols and going to eat the Eucharist? Why is this seeing parallels? It's because the Christians were going to eat food that had been sacrificed to idols, to demons. These were food items that had been sacrificed to idols, which means that the food of the Eucharist was also a sacrifice to God the Father. I repeat, Paul is admonishing Christians for eating food that has been sacrificed to idols and then coming to eat the Eucharist, because the Eucharist is a sacrifice to God the Father. So he's saying you cannot participate in the table, partake of the table of demons, and then partake of the table of the Lord. Why? Because in both instances, sacrifice has happened and sacrifice has happened. So the Eucharist is a sacrifice. So then I will go very quickly to some early first century Christian writings. So unfortunately, one of the things I love most about being Catholic is that we have so much wealth in writings, even outside the Bible. We know what Christian life was like in the first century, before the Bible was made, before there ever was a Bible. What was the glue? What was the most important thing in Christianity? It was the Eucharist. It still is the Eucharist in the Catholic Church and in the Orthodox churches, but in the various denominations, the various Protestant denominations, as we have seen, even their idea of worship has changed. It no longer includes sacrifice, and that is not biblical. So in the Didache, this is a first century document that many believe was even written before the Gospels. It lays down rules and regulations of Christian life and Christian worship. So I wanted to read a part of the Didache. The Didache, some people say it was written around AD 60, but maybe AD 90, between 60 and 100 AD. The Didache says that this is this is a document written by elders in the first century to Christians to tell them how they are supposed to treat the Eucharist. On the Lord's Day of the Lord, gather together. The Lord's Day, by the way, is Sunday. That's where Christians offering their sacrifices on Sunday came from, the sacrifice of the Mass. On the Lord's Day of the Lord, gather together, break bread and give thanks, after confessing your transgressions, so that your sacrifice may be pure. So that your sacrifice may be pure. The idea of the people of God offering sacrifice to God the Father has never gone away. Certainly not in the mainstream Christian movements. It has never gone away in Catholicism. It has never gone away in Orthodoxy. It is only in the modern variations of Christianity where new ideas of worship have come up. And it is those ideas, those of worship, that they are using to judge Catholics. And yet these ideas are not biblical. The people of God have always been a sacrificial people who offer sacrifice. The people of God have always been a people with a priesthood. In the past, it was the priesthood of Aaron and the Levites offering sacrifice in the temple. In the New Covenant, it is the priesthood of Christ, who, by the way, is a descendant of Aaron on his grandmother's side, offering himself in place of all the animals in the Eucharist and on the cross, one sacrifice, and the apostles being given the commission to do this in memory of me. Basically, the sacrifice that that Christ begins at the Last Supper on that table. Do that sacrifice in memory. It must continue till the end of time, because the people of God have always offered sacrifice as worship. Always, and will always do so to the end of time. So the question then is, why in your form of worship, whoever you are watching this, why do you say that the praise and worship music is what qualifies as worship? Where is as good as that is, where is the sacrifice? The Didache continues and actually tells us that the sacrifice of the Eucharist, which we now call the Mass, the sacrifice of the Eucharist is what we as Catholics to call the Mass, was predicted by the prophet Malachi in Malachi chapter 1 verse 11. I'm going to get to that verse in the next person that I'm going to quote, who is Saint Ignatius of Antioch, an elder of the church around 100 AD. So you have Saint Ignatius, an elder of the church around 100 AD, talking about the Eucharist in these terms. Let's go to Justin Martyr. Still, we're talking about around 165 AD, talking about the Eucharist in these terms. He says that he's talking. This book is called the Dialogue of Justin Martyr with a Jew called Trypho. So Trypho was a Jew who was defending Judaism around between 100 and 160 AD. And Justin Martyr was a Christian who was defending Christianity. And Justin Martyr is showing Trypho that it is in Christianity where the perfect sacrifice to God the Father has happened, and that the Jews can no longer offer pleasing sacrifices to God. And then he quotes the book of Malachi, chapter 1, verse 11. I'm going to just look for it here and read it for you. So, Malachi 1:11 reads thus: For from the rising of the sun to its setting, my name is great among the nations. And in every place incense is offered to my name, and a pure offering, for my name is great among the nations, says the Lord of hosts. Other translations read thus: For from the rising of the sun to its setting, my name is great among the Gentiles. And in every place incense is offered to my name, and a pure offering, for my name is great among the Gentiles, says the Lord of hosts. Justin Martyr is a Gentile. And he's telling Trypho that, moreover, as I said before, this is around 140, 50, 60 AD. Justin Martyr is telling Trypho, the Jew. So Christian in 100 AD talking to a Jew in 100 AD, telling him, moreover, as I said before, concerning the sacrifices which you at the time in the Old Covenant offered, God speaks through the prophet Malachi, saying that it is of the sacrifices offered to him in every place by us the Gentiles, that it is of the sacrifices offered to him in every place by us the Gentiles, that is, of the bread of the Eucharist, and likewise of the cup of the Eucharist, that he speaks at that time, and he says that we glorify his name while you profane it. He's basically telling Trypho the Jew that your cows and bulls are not necessary anymore. That what is necessary is Jesus Christ, the one and eternal Lamb, the one and eternal Passover, the one and eternal sacrifice that has given himself as bread and wine in the Eucharist, as an eternal sacrifice and offering to God the Father throughout all generations, because he says, you shall do this in memory of me. Throughout all generations, bread and wine as the body and blood of Christ, the actual physical body, blood, soul, and divinity of Christ. Because you can't have a sacrifice if it is not actual body and blood. If it's not actual flesh and blood, you don't have an actual animal sacrifice. Actual animal sacrifice requires blood. So you have an actual body and an actual cup of blood that we call the Eucharist, that must be offered to God the Father in memory of Christ for all time by all Christians. And therefore, the Mass in the Eucharist is the ultimate form of worship. So you get hung up on Catholics showing affection to the Blessed Virgin Mary by bowing their heads in front of their image, thinking that bowing always means worship when it does not, as we have shown, thinking that statues are always idols when they are not, as we have shown. And then on the other hand, you forget the one and only external, visible, physical sign of worship that God himself has instituted from the beginning of time to the end, which is to offer him sacrifice, which the Jews did in the temple with their animal sacrifices, and which we do now as Catholics and Orthodox in the offering of the Eucharist as the body and blood of Christ to God the Father, in the commandment of Jesus that we shall do this sacrifice and participate in this sacrifice of him to God the Father forever and ever till the end of time. And so I will finish with those words. The video has taken longer than I expected, but I hope, especially for the Catholics watching this, do not be dismayed by these attacks that come to you. Rest in the confidence of knowing that in the Mass, nobody can worship God better than you. And to my brethren out there who are not Catholic, my challenge to you is, where is the sacrifice in your so-called acts of praise and worship? So, if you're a Catholic, get yourself a very nice statue of the Blessed Virgin Mary and give it a very big kiss on the cheek, because that's a picture that reminds you of your mother in heaven. And do not fear to love Mary as much